So I'm going to talk about the events leading up to and the decision to declare independence, and then what some of the immediate kind of political and social changes were in those early years right after the Declaration of Independence, right after the United States became an independent country. So first, the Second Continental Congress met in 1775. Now, last time I talked about the First Continental Congress, which met in 1774, and it told the colonies to prepare for war, and everyone knew that fighting was on the horizon, but they were still at the stage of boycotting British products and stuff like that, and fighting for their rights as Englishmen, as British citizens, subjects. They were not anywhere near declaring independence yet, not in 1774. Well, in 1775, they met in Philadelphia, and right around the time that they met, the war had effectively begun. So on June 15th, they chose George Washington as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army, and he didn't even have an army yet. There were militia fighting against the British in New England, but there was no army representing all of the colonies. Basically, he had to create it from scratch. Interesting thing about him, this is a portrait of him in his military uniform. He showed up at the Second Continental Congress wearing his Virginia militia military uniform, and he didn't say a word. But everyone understood immediately, kind of knowing him, knowing who he was, that he was sending a message, that he was ready to take command if they wanted to offer him the job. And they did. He was chosen unanimously and made commander-in-chief. And the reason he was chosen was because he was a Virginian. They wanted someone from the South, since the fighting at that point was primarily in the North and the Massachusetts area. They didn't want it to be just Massachusetts versus England. They wanted the whole colonies to be united. And he was probably, except maybe for Ben Franklin, the most widely respected person in all of the colonies. So they picked him, but they still disagreed on the purpose of the war. So an important thing to understand is for the first year or two of the American Revolution, they aren't fighting for independence. And George Washington's army isn't technically fighting for independence. It's fighting to defend and preserve the colonists' rights as British subjects, the historic rights of Englishmen. And events will lead to independence, but that wasn't the goal initially. In fact, they sent something called an olive branch petition to King George III, and they asked him to reject Parliament's policies against them. And they had kind of a fiction going. They were kind of pretending, or maybe even lying to themselves, that King George III would be on their side. He was a good king, they were loyal to him, and he must not realize what Parliament was doing. He must not realize how badly Parliament was abusing their rights. And if only he could be made aware, then he would interject himself and stop Parliament, and then they could be loyal subjects again. And this was basically a fiction because King George III was completely in agreement with what Parliament was doing, and some of them knew that. So he responded to the olive branch petition with a proclamation of rebellion, saying that they were all traitors and could be hung for their, or hanged, I guess is appropriate, could be hanged for their treason. And he also declared a naval blockade of the American colonies, and he hired German mercenaries to send to America to put down the rebellion. So for many of them, these were clearly acts of war, and it was becoming more and more obvious that there was no turning back, that the ties that united the Americans and the British needed to be broken. Thomas Paine, in January of 1776, published a pamphlet, an essay called Common Sense. It became a huge bestseller for that time period. It sold 150,000 copies in 3 months, and people would gather around and read it to each other in large groups. So anytime you sold one copy, that meant, dozens of people might be listening to it and reading the essay. And what he did, it was a couple of interesting things. First, he attacked the king directly. He dispensed with the fiction that it was only Parliament to blame. He said, no, 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 no. Monarchy itself is to blame. The king is to blame. That's the root of all the problems. It's a tyrannical form of government that is oppressing us. So he did away with this nonsense that it was just a misguided Parliament that was causing all the problems. Now, up until then, still up until January of 1776, only a minority of Americans called for independence. Ben Franklin and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson wanted independence by now, but most colonists weren't ready to go that far. But he advocated, Thomas Paine advocated independence. He advocated that they do away with monarchy and declare themselves a republic. He attacked the idea of monarchy. He called King George III a brute and blamed him for all the war. And I think he said something, I'm paraphrasing. There was this idea that, an old-fashioned idea that kings ruled because God had put them in these thrones of power, and that therefore you owed a duty to God to obey the king, right? Because God wanted him to have power over you. And Paine said something like, if God wanted kings to rule over us, why did he put this jackass in power? Because it didn't make any sense to him. He said, and he was kind of right, that the world was watching, and he said, quote, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind." He was hoping that America would throw off the monarchy and establish a republic that would be a model for the whole world to see. The pamphlet, like I said, was hugely popular, and it changed many people's minds. George Washington said common sense is working a powerful change in the minds of men. He saw his soldiers and the new Continental Army reading the pamphlet, talking about it, and agreeing with it, that they should declare their independence. So before the United States Declaration of Independence, which came actually kind of late in the process, state and local governments began declaring their independence. In North Carolina, you see a little road marker here showing people where it happened. The North Carolina colony adopted the Halifax Resolves in April of 1776, instructing its delegate to the Continental Congress to push for independence. Local governments began adopting resolutions declaring their own independence. Rhode Island officially declared its independence from Great Britain on May the 4th. So 2 months before the Declaration of Independence, Rhode Island just went ahead on its own and said, we're independent. We don't have any loyalty to the king anymore. But still, in the Continental Congress, 4 or 5 states, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, were reluctant to take that final step. And so debate in the spring of 1776 just kind of dragged on in the Continental Congress about what to do, whether to keep fighting for their rights as Englishmen or fight for full independence. Well, on June 12, 1776, Virginia, this is 3 weeks before the July 4th Declaration of Independence, Virginia adopted a Declaration of Rights. It was written by this man, George Mason. And you're going to see that it very closely resembles the United States Declaration of Independence. In fact, in some ways, all Thomas Jefferson did was paraphrase and rewrite this Virginia Declaration. So it starts by saying that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Notice this is just a longer-winded, less poetic version of what Jefferson put in the Declaration. Right? It has one interesting idea that isn't in the Declaration. Well, it is, but it's expressed in one word, inalienable. George Mason wrote here, they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity. So posterity means your children and your grandchildren, your descendants. Compact meant a contract. And what's interesting, he's saying, you are by nature free and independent, and you cannot give that freedom up, voluntarily or not. You can't contract away your natural right to freedom and independence. So it's such an inherent part of you. Right? He wrote that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people. The magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. Again, this doesn't appear quite so succinct and these words in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, but the idea that magistrates are their trustees and servants, he's flipping on its head the European idea that the monarch is the sovereign and the people are his servants. So in England, George III was the sovereign. In a sense, he owned the country. The country was his. And if you were a British subject, you were his servant, his subject. But this is saying it's the other way around. The country belongs to you, the people, and the king is your servant. And if he doesn't do his job wisely, you can toss him out and get somebody else. That government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. Of all the various modes and forms of government, that is best, which is capable of producing the greatest degree of happiness and safety, and is most effectually secured against the danger of maladministration. And that, whenever any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community hath an indubitable, unalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. Now notice, you're going to see this exact same idea in the Jefferson's U.S. Declaration of Independence. And Jefferson himself admitted all of the ideas in the U.S. Declaration of Independence were already around. He didn't invent any of them. He just rewrote them in better language. And this Virginia Declaration shows you this is how Americans just felt. All up and down the colonies, they all felt that they had inalienable rights that were being violated by the king, and therefore they had a right to rebel. And they were putting it into words in Virginia and in the U.S. Declaration and in dozens of other declarations all over the colonies. So now for getting closer to the U.S. Declaration of Independence, Richard Henry Lee was a delegate from Virginia, and on June 7, 1776, he introduced this resolution. Resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. They weren't ready to adopt his resolution. There were still a few holdouts, so they decided to postpone the vote for 3 weeks. And in the meantime, they appointed a committee with Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams, and two other guys, but they didn't really do any work, participate, Roger Sherman and I think Robert Livingston. They appointed the committee to write a rough draft of the Declaration so that if they did vote for it 3 weeks later, it'd be ready to go. Jefferson ended up being given the primary task of writing the rough draft. And as you can see, he modeled it closely on the Virginia Declaration and other things. They picked Jefferson. John Adams insisted that it be Jefferson because Jefferson was a Virginia, and they wanted Virginia, the powerful colony, to be well represented in their efforts. John Adams was unpopular, and he realized that. He said, nobody likes me. If I write it, people will object to it just because it has my name on it. So Jefferson did it, and then Adams and Franklin got together with Jefferson and kind of proofread it and tinkered with it a little bit, and then they gave it to the Congress. So the U.S. Congress, the Continental Congress, voted for independence on July 2, 1776, and then 2 days later met to formally accept the Declaration of Independence on July 4. John Adams always thought it was funny that people didn't celebrate independence on July 2, because that was the day they voted for it. But it became the habit to recognize the day we formally adopted the Declaration. Here's a picture of the three of them. Jefferson's the one standing, Franklin and Adams sitting, working on the document, what it might have looked like when they were working on it in that building I showed you on the earlier slide. So I'm going to talk about the Declaration itself. I'm going to read parts of it to you and kind of describe them as I go along. And historians kind of divide it artificially into 5 parts. So I'm going to talk about the introduction, the preamble, the indictment, the denunciation of the British people, and the conclusion. And that just helps to organize the different ideas of it. So an introduction, a preamble, an indictment of King George, and a denunciation of the British people, and then a conclusion. So this is the exact language of the introduction. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So this is, again, it's just an introduction. It says why they're writing the Declaration. They're not writing it because they need anyone else's approval or permission to declare themselves independent. He says they're entitled to it by the laws of nature and of nature's God. They're referring to God. They're saying our God-given rights entitle us to do this. We don't need your permission. But out of respect for the opinions of others around the world, we will tell you our reasons. Jefferson wrote about this later. He says the idea here is that God was the author of the natural rights inherent in each human being, and Americans were free people claiming their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Magistrate meaning ruler, president, king. The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. The hand of force may destroy but cannot disjoin them. Alexander Hamilton wrote also a little bit before this, but about the same idea. The sacred rights of mankind are not to be rummaged for among old parchments or musty records. They are written as with a sunbeam in the whole volume of human nature by the hand of the divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by mortal power. What they're saying is that this idea of the laws of nature and of nature's God means that because your right to life, liberty, and property is God-given, A king can kill you, a king can oppress you, a king can deny you your rights, but he can't separate morally your entitlement, you from your entitlement to those rights. Now this is the part that everybody remembers, the most famous part of all. Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." You have all the basic ideas here, the most important principles. It's self-evident that all men are created equal. So it doesn't have to be argued, it doesn't have to be proven, it's just obvious. And it's also self-evident that their Creator, God, this is the second reference to God, endowed them with certain unalienable rights. Among these, not the only ones, but among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Usually the formula was people would say life, liberty, and property. Jefferson interestingly changed it to the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I've mentioned this idea before when I was talking about John Locke. This is the theory of government that the American Republic was founded upon. The theory is the government exists to protect your right to life, liberty, and property, and happiness, etc. And if the government stops protecting those rights, you have the right to overthrow it or change it. Right? And nowadays, we don't need to overthrow it. We can change it every 4 years, 2 to 4 years, just by voting. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. What he's saying here is, you're going to object, well, surely people can't overthrow the government every time they get unhappy about something. Right? The people can't be so fickle, or you'll have revolutions constantly. And Jefferson is saying, no, we're not saying we want to overthrow the government every time we wake up in a bad mood. We want to overthrow the government because a long train of events has taught us over years that this government is out to get us. It is out to be tyrannical. We have tried and tried for years to plead with it, to argue with it. But now, after 10 or 15 years of arguing, we can't avoid the conclusion that the government is not going to change on its own. We have to overthrow it. Or separate from it, better to put. So, what are these train of abuses? What are the things that show them that the king is bent on tyranny, right? On destroying their rights? He basically gives, this is a short, an abbreviated version, but Jefferson lists 27 examples of things that the king or parliament have done bad over the last 15 years or so. So he says, the history of the present king of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He's talking about when the king and parliament dissolved the governments in Massachusetts and New York and Virginia. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Remember, the colonists were upset by the presence of the British Army in Boston and New York when it was supposedly a time of peace. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. This is referring to when the king shut down the port in Boston, so it couldn't trade with outsiders. For imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our legislatures and declaring themselves, he's talking about Parliament now mostly, invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. So it goes on and on, right? A long list of the king's abuses, the things that he has done that show the Americans he has no respect for their fundamental rights. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now, so that was the indictment. Now we get to the denunciation of the British people. Up until now, the Americans have not said anything about the British people, but here they want to say we've had it up to here with you too. He says, nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them, by the ties of our common kindred, to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. So the conclusion there is the important part. Enemies in war, and peace, friends. From now on, you're not our countrymen anymore. Right? You're no longer, we're different now. And then the conclusion. So this is the part where it really, everything else was a justification for this, the key part. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, that's the fourth reference to God, Supreme Judge, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That concludes it. Actually, I had the references wrong. Supreme Judge is the third, and Providence is the fourth reference to God in the Declaration. Notice, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Some of them did lose their fortunes, and at least one, maybe indirectly, his life because of signing this declaration. One of them was caught and tortured and eventually died from the suffering he endured during his captivity and torture. Supposedly, when they signed it, Ben Franklin, who's pictured here standing to the left of Thomas Jefferson, said, now we must all hang together, or surely we will all hang separately. Meaning they've signed the document, so the British now have a list of the names of the traitors, right? They know who to hang if they catch them. So America has declared independence, and I want to briefly talk about some interesting ways that the United States changed over the next 10 years or so because it was now a free country. So they can now pass laws that they liked. Parliament couldn't overrule them. King George III couldn't overrule them. And so they could change some things, things that they had been upset about for years, where it had been building up and they wanted to do something about them, and now they had the chance. So the first thing they did was adopt state constitutions. Let me back up a second. The word republicanism is a key word here for this idea that swept America. They were getting rid of monarchy, they were getting rid of aristocracy, and in turn, they wanted not just a Republican government, but a Republican society. Right? So first they had to adopt state constitutions. The Americans wanted their constitutions written down on paper, usually with specific declarations of rights. They wanted this because the British Constitution was unwritten. Back in 1761, 1764, James Otis was saying things like, Parliament can't pass laws contrary to the Constitution or they're void. And the British had said, what are you talking about? There is no written Constitution. He meant kind of the sum of all the ideas of the laws and acts and bills in Parliament's history. But now they wanted written down so everyone would be able to see for themselves what the Constitution says. You could read it, and you would know what powers the government had and what rights people had that couldn't be taken away. So they wrote their constitutions. They explicitly defined the rights of the people and the powers of the rulers. They said that people had natural rights over which government could not exercise control. And at least 8 of these state constitutions contained specific declarations of rights, such as freedom of religion, speech, and the press, freedom from unlawful searches, trial by jury, etc. Another reform that happened in America in this time period was more social, cultural, and that was evidence of aristocracy was done away with. And one of the things that is kind of a visual example of this is American men stopped wearing wigs. If you've ever seen movies about life in the 1700s, the British and Americans in the colonies wore these wigs that were powdered and expensive, and it was very common. I think Washington had one. You see here Ben Franklin wearing one. This painting was probably done in the 1760s when he was in England. He spent about 10 or 15 years living in London. But towards the end of his life, here he is, no wig, right? The men threw away their wigs because after independence, that reminded them of the British aristocracy, and that just wasn't fashionable anymore. Another example of the end of aristocracy comes in 1783, and this is just as the war with England officially ended, so this is several years down the road. But after the war, Washington and his officers formed a hereditary organization called Society of the Cincinnati, and it was meant to be just something like a club for veterans of the Revolutionary War. And clearly Washington didn't want it to be anything more than that. He had no sinister plans whatsoever. But Americans were so anti-aristocracy that a lot of Americans were upset and protested because they thought this sounds like an attempt to create a new nobility, a new aristocracy. And so Washington withdrew his support for the idea and didn't have any part of it. Another example of the end of aristocracy and the rise of republicanism, states abolished two old-fashioned legal concepts, primogeniture and entail. And I'm going to write those down. It'll be easy to remember what these mean. Primogeniture, the word primo, Latin means first, right? This was a rule or a custom allowing the eldest son to inherit the entire estate, excluding daughters and younger sons. And so the idea here was to keep the estate whole, intact, from one generation to the next, and not dividing it amongst all the children or even all the sons. And that way it would stay powerful, right? But the younger sons would have no inheritance. They would be left poor. And the daughters, of course, would just have to marry into other families. They had no hope for inheritance either. So this served to preserve aristocracies, noble families, by keeping their power consolidated in the hands of the eldest child. But it wasn't a very democratic system, right? And so Americans abolished it in their state legal codes so that inheritance would be equal among the children. Entail was the idea that the rights of inheritors of land were restricted so that they couldn't divide it or sell it or give it away. So this idea goes together with, and I think of it as the word entire. I don't know if there's actually any etymological connection or that's just my way of thinking. But the idea was, so the first son inherits the entire estate and cannot divide it up or sell it, even if he wants to, right? He's legally not allowed to. And this, again, is so that it will be preserved from one son to the next, all the way down through the generations. So they abolished both of these rules. So children would inherit equally, or could inherit equally, and so you could divide and sell your property however you wanted. Another idea had to do with voting. States in the new United States began lowering property requirements for voting. In England, there were property requirements to vote, and very few people owned property, land, and so very few people could vote. In America, land was much cheaper and easier to buy, so more people could vote just because more people could own land. But gradually, after independence, Americans began to think, well, we should lower or even do away with those requirements altogether so that more and more people would be able to vote. Well, more and more men, frankly. And then another one, and this is the most important one, of course, slavery. Now, with all the rhetoric about the natural rights of humans, the natural rights of men, all men are created equal. Some people obviously began to think, well, what about the slaves? Does that apply to them? How do you justify that kind of rhetoric with the practice of slavery? Now, before the Revolution, very few people opposed slavery anywhere in the world, not just in the United States. Slavery was basically worldwide still. There really was no anti-slavery movement anywhere that I know of. There were isolated people who didn't like slavery. John Woolman was a Quaker who was is well known for being an anti-slavery writer. And he would travel around a little bit and get to know people, and he would just talk to them about slavery and why he thought it was evil. And mostly they would think he was kind of a kook. They thought he was like really weird. He was so anti the prevailing ideas of the age. To them, it would be almost as if one of you said, you know, it's really morally wrong of you to keep pets in your house against their will. You'd be like, well, that's silly. But that's how strange he seemed to others of his day, because it was so unusual. So he said liberty was the natural right of all men equally, but he was almost alone in saying that. However, during the Revolution, anti-slavery sentiment spread. During the war, slaves in northern colonies started petitioning for their freedom. Also during the war, slaves earned their freedom, thousands of them, by volunteering to fight on both sides, either for the British, who would promise them their freedom, or an American militia, who would give them their freedom in payment or in return for volunteering. So anti-slavery ideas spread, and thousands became free through the Revolutionary War. I talked about the petition. There's one really famous one I want to mention. Connecticut petition in 1779. The slaves who signed it called themselves Prime and Prince X, and they didn't really sign it. They just made their marks, which means they were basically illiterate. Someone probably wrote it for them, and then they marked it to show that this was their signature. But they have a lot of interest. It's a page or two long. For time reasons, I won't read it to you, of course, but they had a couple of interesting ideas. They pointed out that it was morally wrong to hold them in perpetual slavery because they had not committed any crime, which hopefully seems obvious to you today, but this was a little bit of a radical concept, right? This idea of denying us our freedom, our liberty, when we have committed no crime, is obviously a violation of their inalienable rights. They also pointed out the contrast between the war for liberty, which was going on at that moment, and the practice of slavery. And they weren't alone. Many slaves and many Americans were talking about that. We're talking about fighting a war for freedom where we have slaves, so there's hypocrisy there. They criticized slaveholders for a sin, they said, another dreadful evil, that of holding us in gross ignorance. In other words, they criticized the fact that slaveholders would often not let slaves learn to read, most specifically.
They were afraid of being educated.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. They have this interesting passage here. They said, our skins are different in color from those whom we serve, yet reason and revelation join to declare that we are the creatures of that God who made of one blood and kindred all the nations of the earth. It's a great passage because they say reason and revelation. And what they mean here, by reason, they mean science. And by revelation, they mean religion. They're saying in both ways of knowing the truth, either investigating scientifically or through the Bible, through Christianity, through religion, in both ways, they learn that we are the creatures of that God who made of one blood and kindred all the nations of the earth. So whichever way you go about studying the issue, the conclusion is the same, that they're just like, there's nothing inherent about them that justifies their being reduced to slavery. So they asked the General Assembly whether it is consistent with the present claims of the United States to hold so many thousands of the race of Adam, our common father, in perpetual slavery. We ask for nothing, but what we are fully persuaded is ours to claim. During this period, this revolutionary period, the 1770s and 1780s, a few free blacks challenged the notion of racial inferiority. Benjamin Banneker on the left became very well known as a mathematician and an astronomer. Phyllis Wheatley on the right became one of the most famous poets of the Revolutionary period. She became so popular that George Washington invited her to come meet him and have tea with him. And this was during the war, so it's not like he wasn't busy, but he wanted to meet her because her poetry was so well known. Anti-slavery societies were created. These were organizations whose purpose was to try to end slavery. In 1775, Benjamin Franklin and others created an anti-slavery society. A few years later, 1785, in New York, John Jay and Alexander Hamilton created an anti-slavery society. And by 1792, there were anti-slavery societies everywhere from Virginia up to Massachusetts. And here's the important conclusion of all that. By the end of the 1700s, slavery had been abolished or was on its way to being abolished in all the northern states. So all the ones you see on this: Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont. What is now Maine was the northern part of Massachusetts back then. They passed laws either immediately or gradually abolishing the institution of slavery. Thomas Jefferson, who was one of the biggest slaveholders in Virginia, proposed a law banning slavery west of the Appalachian Mountains. It didn't pass. And in fact, if I remember correctly, it failed to pass in the Continental Congress by one vote. Imagine how different U.S. history would be if they had gotten that one vote and slavery had been banned west of the Appalachians. It's hard to imagine how different it would be. It would be radically different. Many Virginians voluntarily freed their slaves. Not all of them, of course, but thousands of slaves were set free voluntarily. Richard Randolph is the guy on the bottom left. I think he was a cousin of Thomas Jefferson's, if I remember correctly. He set free his slaves. And because they were independent and they could now write their own laws, it was possible for him to set free his slaves. And in the colonial era, it was much more difficult to do. George Washington, who's pictured in the painting there, did not set free his slaves in his lifetime, but over the course of the 1780s and 1790s, he went from being one of those people who never questioned slavery because it had been around him all his life to realizing that it was evil. And so he wrote into his will that all of his slaves should be set free, and they were.